y'all aren't like the first service people. First service people, I get down and talk a little bit, and then I get up here and I stand, and it's like people just talking, and I was over here talking, I look around, everybody's already sitting down. I'm like, people have places to be today, apparently. Goodness. So anyway, I turn that around, and then it upsets the people that come up later, like Gordon. But it's all okay. And I got to echo, I really got to shout out the people that have been coordinating some of the things at our church. And I wish I'd have done this at the first service, so maybe next month I'll remember to do that. But when Dusty was up here this morning talking about the ice cream social last week, man, anybody here last week that's here right now at the ice cream social? There were like what, 5 or 6 different flavors of ice cream, and then there were 2,000 toppings, at least. There was everything. There was crushed up Reese's, Kit Kats, whipped cream, hot fudge, cherries, bananas, I think. Y'all missed it, and it was fun. And then we had young people playing chess, which is going to tie into the message here in a minute. But so many awesome things. The pool party last night was great, although the young people only got about actually 20 minutes in the water because we kept getting thunder, and apparently if it thunders, you can't get back in for 30 minutes. I don't know who made that rule up. Why didn't they pick like 25 minutes or 40 minutes? Who sat there with a watch and said, 30, they're safe? Somebody. I saw that email too, and you're like, how does that happen? I was there, and I did not. I was, and I didn't realize it happened, but apparently people do lose their shorts. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. I didn't actually even wear shorts because I wasn't getting in, and then people threatened to throw me in, and thankfully that didn't happen either. Well, listen, I got to tell you, I am super happy to be back up here again. It seems like it's been forever. And I am just super thankful to be here this morning. I am thankful for each and every one of you that came out here this morning. And this morning we're going to be diving back into this study on the life of Daniel. And that's where we're headed this morning. But before I get to that, I just want to start here. Some of you are not permitted to answer this question because we talked about it in Sunday school this morning. But I've got a picture. Does anyone know who this is? This is what happened in the first service. There were crickets until we put the second picture up, and then this helped the first group. Does that help? I heard a name. What's the name? Close, but no. See, you and I, because Brian and I were close, the same age, we weren't just tiny. That is a man by the name of Bobby Fischer. And Bobby Fischer, just so you know, was perhaps the greatest chess player that America has ever known. He's the first and only American to ever win the World Chess Championship way back in 1972. I was 2. I don't know how old you were, Brian, but we were just tiny. The match, the chess match, was actually played in Reykjavik, Iceland, okay? And it was the most anticipated chess match ever. In fact, the chess match attracted worldwide attention, more so than any chess match before it or since then. It was billed as a confrontation between the U.S. and the USSR right in the middle of the Cold War. And Bobby Fischer actually won the World Chess Championship that year against. This is what was remarkable about the first service. Somebody actually knew who Bobby Fischer beat. Do any of you know who lost that match to him? Okay, so that'll be something for you to study. His name was Boris Spassky of the USSR. And I'm up here this morning talking about chess because every night in Bible school, you can ask anybody that was in my class outside. Every night, we would finish Bible school, our lesson, and then I think just about every single member of my class would play chess. And we played numerous games of chess. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of who won and who lost. We're going to try to protect the innocent. but I will say there are some very good chess players in this church, and that was a lot of fun to do that. And as the week went along, I kind of started thinking about, like, kind of how chess is played. And y'all understand, hopefully, the premise of chess, right? Do you understand what the premise of chess is? The whole premise of chess is to set up your opponent, to take them out and put their king into checkmate. That's the whole purpose, is setting up your enemy. And chess involves a lot of thought. It involves precise calculations and some devilish resourcefulness. Because again, your whole purpose is to set up your opponent to take them out. Now, I want to ask you a question. What's it like to get set up? Is that a good thing or a bad thing if you get set up? It's a bad thing, right? You don't want somebody setting you up. Even if it's on like a blind date. Anybody ever have one of those? That can be bad, right? So anytime you get set up, that's a bad thing. And Daniel, this morning in chapter 6, Daniel chapter 6, he's going to learn what it's like to get set up firsthand. So if you have your Bible this morning, just turn over there to Daniel chapter 6. But before I start with that, I'm just curious, how many of you remember, I don't know, 5 or 10 things maybe from the first 5 chapters of Daniel that you'd be willing to say, yeah, I think I could run down 5 or 6 things that you talked about in the first 5 chapters of Daniel? Anybody willing to say I could do that? Anybody remember just maybe 1 or 2 things from the first 5 books or 5 chapters of the book of Daniel? Anybody? I think I could name 1 thing. That's really great. That's good. My teaching is effective. Listen, it's okay. It's okay. I understand, because as you get a little older, and even when you're young, you can tend to forget things that you've learned, things that you've heard in the past. True or false? True. True. So I understand that happens. So the first thing we're going to do this morning is we're actually going to do a quick little review of the first 5 chapters of the book of Daniel, because obviously most of you, that's just gone out of your head now. So are y'all ready to go? Let me give you another run at that. Y'all ready to go? Yes. All right, let's do this. All right, so Daniel chapter 1, we learned about the siege of Jerusalem. That happened in 605 BC. The chapter introduced us to a young teenager named Daniel, a few of his friends, all of them young, all of them from prominent Jewish families. These young men were taken captive against their will, away from their families, away from their homes. And in Daniel's case, pardon me, because he was from royalty, he had royal blood, he was actually taken away from the very palace in Jerusalem. These young men that were taken were actually the best and brightest in Judah. They were the smartest young men that Judah had to offer, and they were taken away from everything that was familiar to them and taken to Babylon. These young men were prisoners of war. And once they arrived in Babylon, according to the scriptures, they had to learn the language of the Babylonians. They had to learn the customs and the culture of Babylon. Because listen, none of them were ever going back to Judah. That was never going to happen. They were going to become like Babylonians. In fact, so much so that they were all given Babylonian names. Right down to their name, they were going to become Babylonians. And then one day, this is really tragic, but one day, once they got there pretty early on, the scriptures declared that they were made eunuchs. They were taken and forced to have a medical procedure so that they could not have children ever. Okay? And then once they had finished this assimilation into the Babylonian culture, they would become servants in the king's court. Now think about that for a minute. They are going to be forced. That's serious. That was pretty good timing too, really. But listen, they're going to be forced to serve the man who was responsible for everything that had happened to them. That's an incredible thing to think about it, but that's what they were going to be forced to do. And yet, despite everything that happened to Daniel, he and his friends remained faithful. They refused to compromise their faithfulness to God, and they refused to eat. If you remember, they refused to eat the king's food. Remember the king that was set, or the food that was set before them. Daniel sought to be faithful to God. So did his friends. And why did they seek to be so faithful to their God? What was the purpose behind their reasoning that we have to stay faithful to God? And here's what it was. They didn't want to find themselves in a foreign country and have all these horrible things kind of happening to them, and then also be separated from the God that they loved because of the stupid decisions they were making. So Daniel and his three friends, the Bible declares that they resolved to, they committed themselves to, listen, they set themselves to remain faithful to God. And one of the things they did that, one of the ways they did that was by not eating the food that was set before them. It was the king's food. And the king's food had been sacrificed to the king's gods. And much of what would have come on that plate, on their table, they were forbidden to eat by the God of Israel because of what he said in the law of Moses. So they set themselves to stay faithful to God. And we learned in chapter 1 that God blessed Daniel and his friends with favor in the sight of all that cared for them because of that. Then in Daniel chapter 2, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he's trying to get some rest at night, but the scriptures declare that his sleep would flee from him. Does anyone remember why his sleep fled from him? He had a really bad dream. He had a terrifying dream, in fact, is what the scriptures declare. And the king has this troubling dream, and then he calls in his wise men. And instead of just asking his wise men to interpret the dream, which is what usually would happen, he made them not only tell them what the dream was about, but they had to tell him what the dream was. Look, just turn to your neighbor and say impossible. If I come to you some Sunday morning, I just walk up to you and I say, hey, tell me what I dreamed last night. Who can do that? Nobody can do that. But that's what the king demands of his wise men, and unfortunately for them, they cannot do it because no man could. But, lucky for them, even though the king was super angry about that, and his command was that all the wise men in the whole nation would be killed, and you got to ask yourself, how smart was this king? I'm going to kill all my smartest guys. But that's what he said. And then lucky for them, it's reported to the king, and they come to the king and they say, hey, Daniel is going to be able to tell you what your dream was and what your dream meant. So Daniel and his three friends do what we should do when we're put in a tough situation. They go to God and they put it in God's hand, the God that can do all things, and they pray to God and ask for guidance and for wisdom. And the scriptures record for us that the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And here was the king's dream. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image stood before you. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thigh of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand. I had to throw this in because Steve was here this morning. If you read into that, that's the Christmas story right there. Because the stone is representative of Christ. And Christ, his beginnings in the flesh, no human had a hand in that. That was all of God, right? The virgin conception. How much did Mary have in that? It's nothing, right? Gabriel showed up and said, this is what's going to happen. And Mary's like, how's that going to happen? And then Gabriel says, this is how it's going to happen. And Mary's like, but how? And Gabriel's like, because nothing is impossible with God. That where it talks about a stone was cut by no human hand, that's a Christmas story. That's no man was involved in that. That was all of God bringing his son. And the stone, anytime you see stone or rock in the scriptures, it's a picture of Christ. It's a picture of Christ. So there's the Christmas story in Daniel, in case you never saw it before. It struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. That was the king's dream. And Daniel, through the power of God, reveals to the king that the image was to show him what was going to happen with his empire, and then every empire that was going to come after that, including the last great empire that was going to be a worldwide empire and was going to be ruled by God himself. And we know, because of the scriptures, that the ruler of that worldwide empire later is going to be Christ himself. It's going to be Jesus. And so Daniel makes this known to the king. Chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar's pride is just going to get the best of him. And he decides to set up this huge image of gold. Remember that? And he sets up this huge image, and then his command was that when the band started playing, what did everybody have to do? Get on your face before my image. Now, that's not real hard, right? If somebody tells you this is going to happen, just get on your face. That's pretty easy to do. And then if somebody decided, though, I'm just going to stay standing, the outcome of that would be you would end up in a fiery furnace, okay? And, of course, Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not about to fall down before this image, right? Because God's command was don't worship any god but me, right? And don't make a graven image to worship it. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not falling to our knees. So the king's anger grows again. Off they go to the fiery furnace. But to the king's amazement, when he looks in the furnace, you tell me what's going on. The three guys are in there talking to a fourth guy. And they're just kind of up walking around in the furnace, just kind of talking about stuff, unharmed by the fire. It's amazing. And then the king makes the statement that the one looked like a son of the very gods. And I said that when we studied this, how close Nebuchadnezzar was to the truth, right? Because it wasn't just a son of the gods. It was the very Son of God. It was Christ before his manifestation in Bethlehem. So how close Nebuchadnezzar got to the truth, but not quite yet. These guys demonstrate their faith. Their faith is now stretched to furnace-level faith. Wouldn't it be great if you could say that? Doesn't matter if I'm going into a fire. I'm going to stay faithful to my God. That's what they did. God blesses them for their faithfulness. Then Daniel chapter 4. This guy just doesn't get it. Nebuchadnezzar struggling with pride again. Daniel chapter 4, the king has another dream about another image. Does anybody remember what the image is this time? It's a tree. Very good. It's an image of a tree. And Daniel gets to reveal to the king, because the king does what he always does, right? Has this dream, and he calls in all his wise men. They do what they always do and fail. So then, like, every other option gets exhausted. We're going to have to call Daniel in again. So they call him in, and Daniel reveals to the king about this dream. And this dream, if you'll remember, Daniel tells the king the tree's symbolic of you. And he tells him that he's going to be humbled by God, and he's going to be stripped of his kingdom. He's going to be stripped of his power. He's going to be stripped of his right mind. He's going to be living with the cattle in the field. Listen, just like the cattle of the fields for 7 years. That's hard to imagine. But that's what happens to King Nebuchadnezzar. But, because of God's great mercy and God's great love, Nebuchadnezzar has his kingdom restored to him. And if you read the scriptures closely, it would certainly appear that after this experience, Nebuchadnezzar was a changed man. For one, I hope he's there when we get there someday and we're able to ask him, hey, what was it like to live in a field for... He might, but I don't want to talk about that. I think he was a changed man. And then in Daniel chapter 5, by the time we get to Daniel chapter 5, the great empire that had taken Daniel captive has now weakened to the point that it's on the verge of collapse. In fact, by the time we got to the end of Daniel chapter 5, the empire, the Babylonian empire, had been taken by the Medes and the Persians. And we learned in Daniel chapter 5 that one of the things that God told Daniel that was going to happen, because Daniel, now listen, this is years have passed. Nebuchadnezzar no longer king. It's now his grandson that's king, Belshazzar. And Daniel, now an old man. And if you remember, Daniel gets called into this party, right? Remember what was going on at the party? Anybody remember that piece of the story? They're having this big party, and like for all the important people, and they're drinking out of the vessels from the house of God in Jerusalem. And out of nowhere, there's this. Do you know what it was? I heard it. There's a hand. I said to the first service, I wish there was a way that like we could have visual effects, that I could just have a hand like just appear and start writing on the wall, because that's what happened. A hand with nothing else appears and starts writing on the wall, and the king is like, and he calls in all his wise men again, like that's what kings do. I know what it means, calling your wise men. And they do what they always do and are like, we don't know. And then if you remember, the King Belshazzar's mother comes in, and she's like, oh, by the way, there's a guy that can tell you what that says. So they call Daniel in. Daniel tells the crown prince that God had sent a message, and that the message was for him. And here was the message. The crown prince had been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And God was bringing his kingdom to an end, and that it would be given to the Medes and the Persians. And on that very night, that's exactly what happened. And we learn in chapter 5, the amazing thing is that God had actually predicted the very man who would take the city and called him by name. And God had predicted exactly how they would take the city all the way back in the book of Isaiah. You can read about that later today in chapters 44 and 45 of Isaiah. And again, God had specifically given the name of the man who would take the city. Does anyone remember who the man was? Cyrus. Cyrus is the one. God called him by name hundreds of years before he was even born. So he comes and takes the city, but if you'll remember from last time, who gets credit for taking the city? King Darius. King Darius. And King Darius is going to be important to our story today in chapter 6, because he's the king that is king when these events happen. And Daniel chapter 6 verse 1, if you're there, tells us that one of the very first things that King Darius does is to set 120 satraps over the kingdom. Now, a satrap, that's kind of, if you think about it today, it's kind of like a governor. How many governors does the United States have? Very good. I was hoping you'd get that because that was super simple. But there's 50 of them, right? And they all kind of have leadership over a different part of the country. That's what these satraps were. And then we're told here, over these 120 satraps, Darius was going to set 3 men to kind of oversee them. And we're told in the scriptures there that Daniel was going to be one of the 3. And then in verse 3 it says that Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, this excellent spirit that was in him was actually the very Spirit of the living God. And as I was getting this prepared and thinking about it, it really got me to thinking, when people look at me, because if you're a believer, you've got the Spirit of the very God living in you, and it got me to thinking, when people look at my life and how I'm living my life, can they see this excellent spirit in me? Can they see the excellent spirit in you? And it happens the same way for us that it happened for Daniel. Because it really starts to show up as we commit ourselves to being faithful to God, as we love Him and His purposes, and we serve Him, and we pray to Him, and listen, as we draw near to Him and we commit ourselves to Him, and as we do that, people will be saying about you, man, Cease has such an excellent spirit in him. And Brian has such an excellent spirit in him. That's what we should be striving for, because that's what these people saw in Daniel. So Daniel gets promoted, second in command. How do you think that's going to go over with all the other leaders? I mean, you get promoted with 3 other guys, and you're kind of the overseers, and you're all kind of doing your thing, and then all of a sudden, one of the guys gets promoted over everyone. It's not going to go well, right? It's not going to go well. And the problem for Daniel was, he's got some things working against him. We'll just go through a few of them. First of all, he'd reached the top. Wasn't really much higher he could go. And a lot of times when someone is really faithful and they get honored by someone and they get put in a very high position, other people get a little jealous. They get a little envious. So he had that going against him. And then the other problem, Daniel was just like flat out better than everybody else in the kingdom at what he did. He was just really, really great. If any of you are sports fans, any sports fans out there this morning? Anybody watch any sports? So, I don't know, about probably 10, 15 years ago now, there was this team that played sports, played professional football. They were from up in New England. They were known as the Patriots. And they had a quarterback whose name was Tom Brady. How many people like that guy? It's like maybe his kids, I don't know. I mean, he was, listen, and even though I didn't care for him then, I can look back now and say he was a lot better than most people that played the game. And when you get to that point, people can hate you. And then this was probably the worst one, is that Daniel, he was an outsider. He was an outsider. He was a Jew. He wasn't a Mede or a Persian. How dare this guy think he can come in here and be second in command? And I think it was that last one that probably got him hated the most. People do that today, right? I mean, if you're not a part of the in-group and you have some good things happen to you, it still happens today. People get jealous. People get envious. They wanted what Daniel had. So they devise a desperately wicked, a terribly brilliant plan. And the first thing they did was consult with each other, verse 4, to find ground to accuse him before the king. And it says in verse 4, they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. That's a remarkable statement about Daniel. It's a remarkable statement. But listen, these guys weren't going to let that little detail slow them down at all. They were determined to get rid of Daniel. So they realized, verse 5, if we can't find ground for complaint against Daniel, unless what? Where are they going to find something against Daniel? What's the Bible say? Unless they found it where? Against the law of his God. They clearly understood, listen, this is brilliant, really. They clearly understand if we can't take him out because of his weaknesses, we're going to destroy him through his strength. Because the only thing that Daniel was more loyal to than his role for the king of the Medes and the Persians was his faithfulness to his God. And they knew that. So they were going to use that against Daniel. Here's the plan starting in verse 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All of the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, is that true? Did all of the satraps and leaders, did they all come together and agree on this? Is that even true? It's not true. Who would not have agreed to this? It's like the second in command. Daniel would be like, we're not doing that. So listen, these are a bunch of liars who go to the king with a lie, because obviously Daniel's not going to agree to this ordinance, this injunction. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. These men were shrewd. These men were deceitful. They were liars. They were very cunning in their plan. But listen, you got to think, right? You got to think the king's going to think this over a little bit. Because how often, you just tell me, how often do strong leaders, political leaders, how often do they agree on anything? Go ahead, tell me. Never. Never. So what are the odds that these guys all came together? Hey, this sounds like a good plan. So the king should have been asking himself, who are they out to get? I mean, surely he's going to bring his second in command, Daniel, in and be like, hey, they got this idea. What do you think about it? Surely he will not just sign the document. Verse 9. You can't make this up. Therefore, King Darius signed the document. I stand corrected. What a lack of discretion, a lack of discernment the king shows here. No wisdom, no thought for anything other than, what is this? I'll sign it. Off it goes. Off it goes. It's just horrible. I mean, if the king would have even given a little thought to this plan, he would have never signed what he was about to sign. You're like, how can you know that? Just peek ahead there about 5 or 6 verses. Go down to verse 16 in Daniel chapter 6. The king is going to say something to Daniel. Here's what he says to him. May your God whom you serve, what does it say? May your God whom you serve. How did Daniel serve his God? Somebody say it. 6:16. May your God whom you serve continually. Continually. What does that look like? If somebody does something continually, what does that look like? I mean, they're just always doing it, right? Here's how Webster's defines it. Without pause or cessation, unceasingly, as the ocean is continually rolling its waves on the shore. Now, if you've ever been to the ocean, and believe me when I say, I love to go to the ocean, but if you've ever been to the ocean, you know that the only time the waves stop is when? It's not a trick question. When do the waves stop? They never stop. You can go to the ocean right now and guess what's going to be happening? The waves are going to be coming in. It's like constant. They're rolling in the early morning. They're rolling in at lunchtime, in the afternoon, in the evening. That's how Daniel served God. That should get us thinking. Is that how I serve God? Is that what my prayer life reflects? Is that what my service in my church looks like? Is that what my service in the community in His name, for His glory? Is that how I meditate upon His Word, how I muse upon what He says? Would anyone be willing to say, I'm just going to be honest, I'm not there yet. Not even close to being there yet. but Daniel was there. And listen, that should be motivation for us, right? Because listen, we get there the same way that Daniel got there. We get there by drawing near to him, by committing to his purposes, his plans, by loving others according to Jesus. That's how we get there. And that's who Daniel's heart was. That's how Daniel's heart was. That's how our heart should be as well. Without ceasing, all the time, constantly serving our God. That was Daniel. That was Daniel. But it's also the reason why his enemies were so eager to get this plan in motion, right? Because they knew, and the king should have known, that Daniel's not going to be able to help himself because tell me again, how often does he serve his God? Continually. They're like, we're not even going to have to wait a full day, man. He's going to sign this and tonight at 7 o'clock, Daniel's, well, let's just look at it. Verse 10. You can't make it up. This is how God works. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, loved Daniel, went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem, got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Now, let's say you were in Daniel's shoes. Document signed. You're going in with the lions. You make petition to anyone other than the king for 30 days. What are you going to do? Not pray for 30 days? Maybe you just won't pray. Got to understand. Maybe you'll still pray, but you won't close your eyes. You won't bow your head. No words coming out, just in my mind. I'll pray to God. He'll know. Maybe you go in your basement, and shut everything up, and close the doors, and turn on some music so they can't hear you, and pray to God that way. So what does Daniel do? Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait till the end of August because we're already out of time this morning. So you'll have to come back next time to see what Daniel does. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word that is eternal. I thank you for your word that is true. I thank you for your word, Father, that challenges us. If we claim to follow you, if we claim to love you, if we claim to be one of your children, just as Daniel clearly did, then, Father, people should be seeing an excellent spirit in us because the Scriptures declare that your Spirit dwells within us. They should also see that we are people of integrity, that we're people that are serving you continually. Father, I pray that you would challenge each one here as you have challenged me on this, and that as we go out into the world this week, that we would be considering and thinking about how we serve you and how we represent you to others in this world. And Father, I pray that you would be conforming us and transforming us into that image so that we are people like Daniel was. Father, I just pray for each one who is here this morning that you would be with them, that you would protect and strengthen them, Father. And I pray that you would bring us all back safely here to this house of worship again next Sunday. And I pray these things, Father, in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.